Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm so excited to bring you another science fiction fantasy wrap up. So this is where I talk off the cuff about books that I've recently read in these genres, and for the most part these are going to be new releases as well as some backlist books that I'm really excited about. And in this list is some science fiction that actually made me think or use my brain, and I've realized that that is what I've been looking for ever since I read Blindsight before. And so if you're interested in that too, or have recommendations for me, let's discuss down below. All that being said, let's get started. First off, let's talk science fiction, and I read A Fire Upon the Deep by Vernor Vinge, and this is a classic, well, not a classic, I gotta stop doing that because people tell me this book isn't that old, but essentially this is a very iconic space opera that I've seen all around online. I know that Moid loves it from his channel. I know that Michael from Fit to Be Read also loves this book, and so I've been dying to read it. I was so excited to check this one out that I actually bought myself my own copy, which I never do, or rather I never buy books before I've read them for the most part. But I was so confident that this was going to be a favorite that I decided to pick one up at a used book sale. And if you're not familiar with this book, the basic premise is that it starts out with this amazing prologue where humanity is running from the technology that they have created that has well possibly become sentient, but that's only the setup for the story, because we end up following the children that are on this ship that is escaping, and they end up on another planet with some other sentient life, and you follow siblings that get separated and they end up kind of on different factions or kind of on different sides, and you get to see the alternating perspectives of them as well as the local alien life, which appear to be very dog or puppy like. Now, this is the book I was referencing in the intro to this video that I found to be very interesting, compelling. It really made me use my brain, which I realize I don't get to use enough when I'm reading. And what I mean by that is a lot of the books I read, especially when it comes to like new releases in science fiction, they're very fun, but they're very fun from an aesthetic perspective. So I often talk about a lot of space opera where they're interesting, but the technology just isn't that far different than ours. And you almost could take the same characters and put them inside a Starbucks and they'd be having the same conversations and the story wouldn't be that different. So I was really pleased just by the world building of this one, which was definitely my favorite part, although I will still say that the characters were likable. I like the children, which isn't always my favorite when it comes to books when they have kind of children protagonists, but in this case I thought it worked really well. And the world building, like I said, was just fascinating for me because it was so different. It felt so otherly. We follow these aliens and we get to see from their perspective. And it's interesting because when we see the world from their perspective, they just feel like entities or people. But when you see them from the humans' perspectives, you see them as these strange alien puppy-like creatures. And I think that this book really plays around a lot with the idea of perspective, how things just look different depending on where you're coming from. And within this book, there's just some really cool ideas that the author explores. The idea that you have creatures that can connect their consciousness together, kind of like a Star Trek Borg sort of setup where they are a hive mind and sharing ideas and being or acting as one person. I thought it was so interesting. I spent a lot of this book trying to just determine or figure out the details of that, and it's definitely a book I'm going to reread because, again, I loved it so much, but I'm sure that there's more I'm going to pick up on my second read or things that I missed this first time around. But I thought it was great. It was exciting. It was very well paced. It's reasonably long. It's a mass market paperback I have here, and it's pretty long, over 600 pages, but I flew through it and just found myself wanting to know what was going to happen next, and was, yeah, overall really happy with it. I know there's a sequel, which I do own, and I'm really excited to get to that one as well. Then I also read Artifact Space by Miles Cameron, and this is a space opera from a really renowned fantasy author, and so I was really interested when I found out that he's actually written some science fiction. In the story, we follow a young woman who is trying to escape her past, and she ends up kind of lying and sneaking onto the ship under false pretenses, and so because of that she gets to escape her life and go off into space. The elements of the story that I really liked were some of the ones involving the world building. This author is known for writing really dense, complex fantasy, and so I wasn't surprised to find similar elements in a science fiction. That being said, compared to something like The Fire Upon the Deep, I did find this one to be a little bit more simplified than I was expecting it to be. It's very approachable, it's set in a very near future, and so the language and banter between the characters feels very present day. And again, the technology, while the author spent some time really precisely describing the ship and things like that, which I appreciate. There's some diagrams, all of that. So if you like that stuff, I think you'll geek out there. But the story itself was just a little bit more simple than I expected. I did get some vibes of The Expanse with similar kind of tone and setup and near future setting. So if you're looking for that, you might want to check this one out, but I didn't find the characters to be as strong. So I like this one, but is it an all-time favorite? Not necessarily, but I definitely want to check out more of this author's work because I thought he has really good prose. Next, I want to talk about Silver Queendom by Dan Koboldt, which is a book I received for review from the publisher. And this is a story that follows a group of individuals that run an inn in their little town. However, they're not very good at their jobs. However, that isn't really an issue because this inn is really just a front for what they actually do. And that is the fact that they are a group of con men that like to pull off really fun heists. And so within the story, essentially we follow them on their next adventure. And I am someone that loves heist stories. I am a sucker for them. So anytime you see a book with that synopsis, I have to check it out. I will admit that this is perhaps not my favorite of the subgenre. I do think there are stronger ones out there, but it hit on a lot of the tropes that I enjoy. It had some good banter, it was funny, and while it was perhaps predictable, I would argue that when you're going to pick up a heist story, you're kind of looking for certain elements, so I can't really criticize the book too much for that. So I like this one. I thought it was fun, and if you're like me and just have to read every single heist story that's out there, this is one you might want to put on your list. Next, I want to talk about Ithaca by Claire North. It's a book that I received for review from the publisher Orbit Books. And this is a piece of historical fantasy that tells the story of the wife of Odysseus. And this is a really interesting story because I think everyone is quite familiar with Odysseus, even for people like myself that aren't really well versed in a lot of classic myths. But this story focuses on Ithaca as she stayed home while the men went away and just what they had to do to protect their land and so forth. And this is a book that I was really intrigued to pick up. I will admit that I don't read a lot of historical fantasy. It's probably not my go-to genre, but I really did want to try this one and I was really pleased by it. I liked it. I will say that if this is your go-to genre, I suspect you're going to love it even more. I thought the prose was really beautiful. I thought the characters were well drawn. I love the female feminine ideas and themes that were explored in this book. It's very much about the women who have to take care of things at home because all the men are gone away. And I liked a lot of things about this book. It's very beautiful. It is more slow paced and again, perhaps not the epic, exciting adventures that I'm often drawn to. But despite, again, it not being to my personal taste, I ended up loving it quite a bit, despite the fact that it's not really a niche genre of mine. So again, I think if you like stuff like Circe, I suspect that this one will scratch a similar itch. I haven't read that one, but I know that they're very similar in terms of premise at least. Anyway, so I do recommend this one if it's up your alley. And I also read Babel by R.F. Kuang, and this is a historical fantasy novel that is a standalone that is set during a historical period in the setting of Oxford University. And within this world, we follow a group of individuals that are of course coming from around the world to go to this university and study language and translation. And within this world, because it is a fantasy story, there involves a magic system where they actually use language and translation to imbue objects, and so that is how the magic system works. I will say that I went to this one as someone who loves the Poppy War trilogy. I love all three books, and I know that's unpopular. Not everyone loves the final book, but I adore them. I went to this book knowing that this one was going to be quite different, that it's set in a different world and setting and all of that, and I went in with those expectations. And I will say that I think your interest or enjoyment of this book is going to be very different than the other books. So I think regardless of how you feel about the Poppy War, you may want to consider checking this one out if it sounds up your alley. I know that this one is marketed as dark academia, and I will say that it's less dark than I was expecting it to be, but I enjoyed so much about it. It was not entirely to my taste, and I think it's just the fact that I tend to be drawn more to secondary world fantasy where you have more of an epic feel to it. And this one, again, is very much set in our world, and the magic is actually very toned down. It is there within the book. Some people say it's really not. It is there, but it's very quiet how it's done. And while the magic system is fascinating and how it is designed, it's kind of secondary to the main story. Within the story, we follow different characters. I know other people got really attached to the characters. I less so. I found them to be interesting, but I never fully attached to the characters themselves. What I did love about this book though was how it discusses themes surrounding language and translation, and particularly how language is used in a colonial setting, and the idea of having a universal language or forcing one's language on other people, how that would affect their culture, and just how words really can't be truly completely translated from one language to another without losing some of the meaning, because different words just simply mean different things in different languages, and you always have imperfections when you attempt to translate. And so those parts of the story I found absolutely fascinating. I did this on audio, which I do recommend because there's multiple narrators, and you actually get different narrators that are doing the translated parts, so when things are spoken in other languages. And I appreciate that because I fully admit, as an English speaker, I know that I wouldn't have fully understood the nuances if I was just reading it on the page. And so I thought this book was so well done. In the Poppy War, I loved it, but I do recognize that at least the first book really did feel like a debut, and it did have its flaws. This book felt so polished, so complete. And while I didn't necessarily love it, it wasn't a full 5-star read for me. I appreciate so much about it. It was still a solid 4 stars. And I'm just so impressed by this young woman, this author, who has accomplished more in her life while she's still in her 20s than I could ever hope to dream of. I think that she's just an incredible writer. And if this is what she's writing as her sophomore series or book after her original trilogy, I think that we are going to see amazing things coming from her for many years more. And so if you can't tell, I'm really impressed. It wasn't entirely the kind of book that I'm going to stamp 5 stars on for me, but I'm not surprised to see all these gushing reviews out there where people are completely connecting and giving it the full 5-star treatment, because it was very close for me. It was excellent. It was so well done, and I really, really respect it. It's just one that I will really be left thinking about and definitely want to revisit again. And last, I want to talk about Sons of Darkness, which is an Indian-inspired epic grimdark fantasy that I first heard about, I think, on Twitter, but I actually got really excited for it when I saw Petrick's review, and he gave it a gushing, glowing review, one of his favorite debuts of the year. And so I had to check it out for myself. This book was kind of blurmed as the Indian Game of Thrones. Essentially, it is a grim, dark retelling of a very classic Indian myth surrounding their gods and religion, and so I really wanted to check it out. I do admit that I'm not very familiar with the roots of that story, and I do think that I would have enjoyed this book more had I had more understanding of Krishna and the other gods and all of that. And so I do think that other reviewers, perhaps Own Voices reviewers, or those just more well-versed in Indian culture, are going to get more out of the story. My main complaint with this book, though, was less so about that and more so the fact that I do struggle with grimdark fantasy not being as grim and dark as I would like it to be. I adore A Song of Ice and Fire because of the fact that it is unflinching and dark, and there are so many terrible things that happen. And in comparison to a book like that, this one felt pretty light. I found the characters to be reasonably likable at times. I didn't feel like the things that were happening were that terrible, considering the fact that it's set in kind of a different time period and there is war, and it didn't hit me as hard as I wanted. So I will say I was a bit underwhelmed by this book because I was hoping for a really grim, dark experience. But if I hadn't known it was grim, dark, I don't think I would have been as harsh on this book. I actually thought it was very well drawn. It is very epic in scale. The writing is great, and it's just very large in scope. So you have that epic experience. I think if you like things like Arcane and Upon a Burning Throne, other Indian-inspired fantasy that I've recently read and reviewed, I do think you should check this one out. I wish this book had been darker, but keep in mind that I'm also a horror reviewer with a really high tolerance for really messed up books, so maybe my perception is a little bit skewed. If you want to hear more about this book, I definitely recommend Petrick's video, which I will have linked down below. And I'd love to hear in the comments, does everyone else adore Petrick's fantasy channel? He is my go-to guy for all things fantasy these days, and I hope that you already subscribe. If you don't, definitely go check him out. I think he's fantastic and would love to send more people his way. All right, so that's it for this video here. I'd love to hear of the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? I would love for you to recommend me science fiction books that actually have really complex world building that made you think and use your brain, as well as other books that you think might be up my alley, especially some grimdark books that are truly grim and dark. I would say that the Song of Ice and Fire books, yes, are very dark, as well as the Broken Empire trilogy by Mark Lawrence, but besides that, a lot of the grimdark books I've read have been pretty tame. So give me your best recommendations down below. Let me be terrified and disturbed by the books that you recommend. All that being said, if you're new to my channel, I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and true crime. If you want to help me out with this video, you can share it online, you can give a thumbs up, you can drop a comment, even if it's just a spaceship or a dragon. And if you want to help me out more, you can hit that little notification bell. That way you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.